Okay, there we go. Hello, I'm Edwin Rush, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and today I'd like to welcome you to this empathy dialogue circle with James Damore, a former Google senior engineer who wrote a memo for which he was fired, and Indy Young, who had her start as a software engineer and is the author of 2 books. One being Practical Empathy, and the other one is Mental Models. And so thanks for taking part in this empathy circle with me, and to talk about the memo and its consequences. And is there anything else you'd like to say about, about introducing yourselves before I take the next step?
I could say that I do empathy research in the problem space. So I have to admit in advance that I have a way of doing something I call a listening session, which is slightly different than an empathy circle. So I was trying to learn how to do the empathy circle. Hopefully I won't mess it up.
James, anything else you'd like to add?
No.
Okay.
I'm ready.
All right. Okay, good. So I'll explain how we do the empathy circle. So this is a structured dialogue process where we try to create a space for everyone to be able to fully express themselves and be heard to their satisfaction. So in this process, one person will speak, and they will select either one of the other 2 to speak to. So I'll be included in this too. And you can speak to that person who's the active listener, and you speak, share whatever you'd like to talk about, and then the active listener will reflect back their understanding of what the speaker has said. And the idea is for the speaker to be heard to their full satisfaction, that what you've expressed, you've heard it back from the listener. And so as the speaker, some tips: you want to pause often, because if you say a whole bunch of stuff, it's really hard for the listener to kind of reflect back. And as the listener too, if you start feeling kind of like overwhelmed with, oh, there's so much, like I'm never going to remember this, you can step in and say, oh, let me just reflect back what I'm hearing, so you can actually interrupt and just to reflect that back. And you're free as the speaker to say whatever you want. It's not a PC place here, politically correct, anything you want to say. So as the active listener, you're wanting to convey you can convey in your own words what you're hearing the speaker say. You can summarize, you can paraphrase. If you want to just say it word for word, that's fine too. And it's really about the speaker being heard to their satisfaction. So as the speaker, once you've felt like you've been heard, or 5 minutes is up, we're going to have a 5-minute time limit on this, because some people kind of go on and on and on. So we're going to just have that limit. And so once you've felt heard and you're ready to let kind of move on, you can just say, I feel fully heard. And that's the sign that it's now the listener's turn to select one of the other 2 in the circle here and speak to them. And we just keep going for the time allotted. And I think that's about it for just a basic introduction to the process. And if someone would like to start, our question really is how are you about this memo and the consequences that came out of it? Or you can talk about anything you want. I mean, you're totally free to bring up anything that's kind of alive and you have energy for. So perhaps someone would like to speak to me, and I can just kind of model the empathic listening to begin with. So
we're both like,
yeah.
You first.
Okay, I'm hearing Indy, you're kind of saying, you first. Kind of making a little bit of a joke about the
sorry. Yeah.
So I guess you've begun.
Oh, I have. That's not fair.
So I'm hearing it, you're saying it's not fair. You're feeling like this is not a fair.
Yes, because I would like to hear, I would like James to begin maybe speaking with respect to his experience. I understand that there must have been a lot of thoughts going through your mind, James. And I think that, I mean, especially after that memo got leaked, and maybe you're thinking right around the time that it got leaked and sort of that idea of leaking and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm curious about. Maybe that would be a good spot to start.
Okay, so what I'm hearing there, you really would like to hear from James about his experience about when this memo got leaked, and you're feeling that that's, and his thoughts about that and experience around that, and you feel that that would be a good place to get started with.
I feel fully heard.
Oh, okay. Good, so thanks for that. I was just modeling. And I'll speak to James, and so, yeah, I'm very curious as well as, what happened, how this memo came about and, what your experience was. And so I have a real curiosity about that as well. So if you'd be willing to just reflect that back.
Yeah, so you're curious about the beginnings of the memo and my experiences afterwards?
Yeah. And I'm noticing there's kind of like I feel like real irritation with Google about firing you. It's like, I feel a little bit like irritated. I feel very irritated about the way they handled the whole situation and kind of feel a little pissed off about it. Even though it didn't happen to me, I still feel pissed off about it.
Yeah, so you feel angry that Google fired me and maybe they mishandled the situation?
Yeah, I feel hurt.
Okay. So should I start?
Yeah, and you can either one of us, you can select who you want to speak to.
Okay, I guess I'll speak to Indy then.
Okay.
All right, so to go over some of the history and my perspective on why I wrote it. So I had many personal conversations with people on a lot of these topics, and I felt like there was a lot of misunderstanding between people, and just people had completely different worldviews, and it was sort of a religion at this point. And I was trying to understand why some of these breakdowns of discussion happen.
Okay. So what I hear you say is in the beginning, you felt like there was a religion about something, and I want to hear from you to clarify what that something was, but that there are maybe sides being taken and people being intractable about it, and that you wanted the discussion to happen. And I also want to hear what you mean by discussion. So maybe a little bit more about what the thing is that was getting religious about first.
Yeah, so the religious aspect was the different political ideologies. They became sort of unquestionable, and there was only one ideology that was acceptable at Google. And because people have lived in bubbles throughout their life, education and college and now Google, they really hadn't been exposed to differing viewpoints. And they keep telling each other that other viewpoints are evil, uninformed, or just racist in some way. And so that, I felt like, was breaking down a lot of the discussion.
Okay. I hear you say that political viewpoints were sort of all homogenous within Google, and that thinking about the other side meant saying they were evil or uninformed, and that it seemed to break down discussion. And I'd still maybe like to understand what political, maybe an example or something, so that I can get my head around this, where you were, what was happening.
Yeah, I guess I think there's multiple examples of it, but so the left's ideology, at least as when it applies to gender, is that there are no differences between the genders
Mm-hmm.
is all socially constructed.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, the entire gender gap is due to sexism. And there's
Okay.
no other explanation.
Mm-hmm.
And if you say any other explanation, you're a bigot, basically.
Okay, good. So I hear a really clear example that within Google, you were seeing people all adhere to the idea that I'm going to use that phrase, nurture, not nature, that it was all the way that you were brought up, and that the reason or cause of gender gaps is gender discrimination, and that seemed to be the only way that you were allowed to speak about or around the subject. And I'm sensing that maybe you tried to speak differently around it, and I'm sensing that maybe there was something happening there.
Yeah, so I mean, I would have one-on-one discussions with just people on my team, and it would take a little while to convince them that I actually knew my stuff and I wasn't just spouting nonsense. And I mean, the fact that I was in a PhD program on a lot of these things helped. And there were many people that when you talk to them just one-on-one, they would be like, yeah, I agree completely. But then when you talk in a group, they wouldn't feel empowered enough to say anything.
Okay.
And so that was one dynamic that I thought was really dangerous to, whenever people have private preferences that they're not willing to publicly state, that causes a lot of issues.
Okay, so what I heard was two things. One was that you felt that you had to pull out your PhD in order to convince anybody that what you were saying wasn't a bunch of nonsense, and that you were worried about the toxicity of the environment when people were unable to say in a group setting what they had told you they felt as a belief in a private setting.
Right. And
Okay.
I guess a quick clarification. I didn't finish my PhD, but
okay.
I at least had studied a lot of biology and psychology, much more than just the computer science colleagues that I had. And so I felt like this small scale interaction that was happening just within my colleagues was also happening at a larger scale in the company around a lot of these diversity programs. And this became evident when I went to those programs and their classes, and they would say things that just, they would just point to, we have 20% women, they're 51% of the population, therefore sexism. And they would be completely closed to any other explanation. And I felt like there was a whole other perspective that they were missing, and that they really need to be aware of if they want to address the gender gap. Because if you only say that the gap is sexism, then you're only going to try to reduce sexism, and you're not going to try to, for example, rework the workplace to make it better for some natural working environments, like more cooperative. And you're not going to accept anything that's not 50-50.
Okay, so what I heard you say is that you noticed this in your own team, in your one-on-ones and in your groups, but you sensed it at the rest of the in the rest of the company. The way that you sensed it, I believe you said, was when you started going to the diversity training, and only one cause was presented, and you felt there could be multiple causes, and if we were or they were open to exploring multiple causes, then there could be multiple solutions put in place.
Right.
Okay.
And so this document was something that I just put my thoughts down on and was really seeking feedback, because they were my thoughts, and I felt like if if I could only be proven wrong, then, things weren't as bad as they seemed. But so I was actively seeking feedback and, please point the holes in this argument. And, I did get some very constructive feedback when I just sent it one-on-one to random people that I knew. But once it became viral, it became very difficult to contain all the shaming and all these negative aspects of it.
No, I can totally imagine. Okay, falling out of the cycle here. So I hear you say that there's a little leap. I was kind of surprised that you said, okay, so when I wrote the document, what was in your mind from the last little round was that, hey, there's not just one cause, there's probably 2 causes or 3 causes or several causes. And if we were to explore all of the causes, maybe not all at once, but all, more than just one, then we could come up with more than just one solution. That was what was on your mind. And you sat down to write this document. And you were seeking feedback about, you wrote the document because you hoped, this is the part I don't understand, because you hoped somebody would shoot holes in it and show you how you were wrong. And that would mean things weren't as bad as they actually, as you thought they were. Which things weren't as bad? The program, the training program, the diversity at Google. Which things? That's the part I don't understand.
Mm-hmm. So, I guess there were multiple aspects to the document. So one was that the social science that we're using to justify a lot of these programs is itself very biased and is only tries to test hypotheses within this one worldview. And so, and even the results of it are very inconclusive, but Google seems to just cherry pick the positive results without looking at the meta-analysis that looks at everything and sees there isn't really much of a difference in some of these things.
And this is all true of all science, right? But anyway, go on.
And so I wanted, because I just had kept hearing this from Jonathan Haidt and some others, and I haven't seen anyone that's been able to dispute that. So it was a very sad thing to see. And also just, I wanted to hear if they even know about some of these things, and because I feel like no one feels empowered to even speak up, and so they never address any of these concerns.
Okay, so the thing I was not understanding in the last round was kind of what shoot holes in what, and maybe which things aren't as bad as before. This time you said there's this thing that happens with scientific studies where when you're in a group, the group wants to believe certain parts of it and not really take it as a whole or as science. Oftentimes, and I'm all like, my own opinion is like science doesn't get understood by the population in general as the way it works. But that happens. So your response was to try to let people know that there are parts of the experimentation and the studies that were going on that had negative results, and you wanted to make sure that the rest of the group knew about it.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I get it yet. We'll keep going. Yeah.
It's just that I felt like we weren't having an open discussion on these things, and that I felt like they were in their own bubble, and maybe I was in my own bubble, and I really wanted to reconcile the two. And unfortunately, what happened, a lot of it was just, no, you're completely wrong because you don't follow our ideology. You're a sexist bigot. And so the discussion that I wanted never really happened.
Right. So I hear you saying that it, so sort of what happened afterwards when it got out beyond just the individual personal people that you sent it to and got good feedback from, that people started saying, no, you're wrong, as opposed to looking at it as, those are different results and different studies, and you're a bigot, you're a sexual bigot. And that felt like it went in a completely different direction than what you wanted, which was to sort of reconcile or maybe open up the conversation or open people's awareness to different points of research or studies or approaches, and see if you could have people hold all of that in their mind together. Is that sort of close?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess just the bubble effect was much stronger than I thought it was.
Right. Yeah. So kind of surprise and dismay, probably. Maybe it sounded like more surprise that the bubble effect was a lot stronger than you had expected. Maybe it was a different environment than you had tried this kind of communication in before. Maybe different colleagues here or something.
Yeah, I felt like when it was one-on-one and you could actually see the person's face, they wouldn't say these horrible things to you.
Mm.
But when you're just, some profile and they don't know you,
Mm-hmm.
and they feel empowered in the anonymity of the mob to just say these horrible things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that I got good, I'm kind of collecting this from back behind too. I got really good feedback when I was face-to-face with people, even when I sent the email one-on-one to people that I knew or knew me. We could have some sort of debate, maybe. I still don't know what the discussion is. Debate maybe about what the points are or the meaning of the points, or maybe debate about how to reconcile them or hold them all in our mind all together. Or maybe it's debate about how to spread the word or help people within the organization expand their bubbles a little bit to include this too. I don't know which of those things it might have been discussion about, but it sounded like when it was one-to-one, it worked. When it went one-to-many, suddenly you were just a profile that people felt like they could rain down horrible words on, and that maybe you would have thick skin and be able to ignore it, or you're like, what? It's the power of the mob or the sort of mindset of the mob, and they feel or get caught up maybe in the excitement or drama of throwing rotten tomatoes.
Well, we had the 5-minute time limit, which I've let that go. So maybe we should bring that in if
okay. Well,
James, if you're feeling heard enough, and so
I'm happy to keep going if you want.
Yeah. So, Indy, who would you like to speak to?
I will speak to James.
Okay.
What do I do? So I'm like, this is where I have to admit to you that I am used to doing this, like I said, a different way as a listening session. And so I would stick close to you and we wouldn't talk about me. So I'm a little at odds as to like, oh, well, what do I say? Normally it's just about one person. So you
can just reflect that back too, James.
Oh, okay.
What did you just hear Indy say?
Yeah, so you're feeling some apprehension just because you normally do a very different or slightly different variant of this listening session where you stay much closer to the person and it becomes less about you than it is about them.
Yeah. It's not apprehension, just a little embarrassment because I'm not very good at this yet. So sorry. But what I was interested in when I heard Edwin talking about the fact that he was able to get a hold of you. And I had definitely heard about the memo, when it went through, and watched the drama unfold. And of course, the polarization, and I'm in my own bubble. And of course, I only heard about one side, of the polarization. But since then, I have been doing a lot of listening. You have been active and doing interviews and talks, and even speaking individually with other people about it. And so I felt a lot of admiration for the fact that you didn't just go hide in a hole. That's hard, especially when you have been shamed, is the word that you used. That wasn't something that was on my mind when I had read about it. But when you had been made so public a target, so not hiding gave me a lot of respect for that. I'm interested in, so I went and listened to a bunch of those as well. And one of them that stood out was the nurture versus nature thing that NPR, Shankar Vedantam did in, what was his podcast called?
Hidden Brain?
Yes, that's it. Thank you. I am not good at remembering titles. I was going to call it On Being, which is Krista Tippett. So different thing, but similar.
Might want to give him some time to reflect.
Okay,
there.
Sure. Yeah. See, I'm not good at this
part. So you were aware of the Google Memo controversy, and you were aware of the polarization on one side. I'm not sure which side that you're referring to, but you started becoming more aware of both aspects of the polarization, and then you saw me do interviews and speak out on these topics, which you say you admired because maybe just staying silent would be easier in many ways.
Yeah, pretty much. And I'll answer the side of it. So of course, I am coming at it from my own experience as a female in technology, and my own, and as a female in the greater world, and my own. I am not a girly girl, and I have always constantly fought to. Not constantly. I shouldn't say constantly. There have always been a steady stream of people who are of the male sex, and they don't treat me the same way, the way that I would that I think of myself. So I come from that side of it. It is a real thing. But when I look at it from my own point of view, the diversity issue is not an issue of numbers, but an issue of comfort. And that would apply to any sort of diversity, age or color or sex, or accents, fashion choices. It's any kind of discomfort that someone feels when they're in a group, and they are, as a group, like you had said earlier, individually there's less of this, but as a group, the group can cut you down. So I think that's what I was thinking in terms of diversity. However, it's interesting to me that when I am in groups, I have never encountered this. And in fact, most of the groups that I work with are at least half or more female sex. So
you want to give them a chance to reflect?
Go for it. Yeah, exactly. So your turn.
So you were introducing your perspective on the polarization, and you said, as a female that was in coding, and just female in general that has multiple experiences in the world, you do see that, especially as maybe not the most feminine girl or woman, that some men treat you differently, and so there is differential treatment happening, and that you see a lot of these diversity things more about comfort, which at least my vocabulary would be inclusion.
Right. Yeah. Probably similar. Mm-hmm.
And which I agree with. And you mentioned that you haven't seen much of a problem yourself, but I guess I'd like to get more about that.
Yeah. It's a very it's interesting in that the discomfort that happens in a gender situation happens one-on-one mostly. Whereas discomfort from like a fashion standpoint or a color of your skin standpoint or whatever may also happen one-on-one, but may also be encoded in the environment. Take, for example, if you are non-binary gender, and you wish to use a bathroom and you really got to go, and you can choose whichever bathroom. It depends on how you feel that day. But the environment is not encoded that way. And in certain places, there's now laws where you have to follow a certain code. And so maybe as a person with a different color of skin, you may encounter people doing the double take or having some sort of a reaction that way. My partner, his brother would get pulled over for the color of his skin by police officers a lot, even though he's a firefighter. So these things happen, I think, more in a one-on-one situation. With the gender thing, it's always, in my experience, the experiences that I've had have been one-on-one. And you, when you're in that situation, you want to preserve your working relationship with that person, and yet send the signal that you wish not to engage in this sort of playing with, being interested in each other or something like that, for something beyond just the work that you want to get done and the design and features and products and algorithms that you want to put out there to help other people.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that you see a lot of these inappropriate interactions in one-on-one interactions, both with gender ones and potentially race ones. And I guess that would often be because there's some self-policing within groups to avoid inappropriate behavior, and that that causes some problems because it's a difficult situation to try to preserve the working environment or working relationship while also not, or being able to decline these maybe sexual advances that you get.
Yeah, and also
that was also the time. Just I was like,
okay, good.
Minutes.
I was going to say
I'm going to keep a little stricter on the time. I have a little thing here.
Oh,
so.
You even have a little thing, yeah.
So
yeah.
James, you can select who you want to speak to. Sorry.
Well, you can speak now.
No, you can speak to me, and that will bring it to me.
Yeah, and then that'll bring him in.
Well, I guess I'm not sure what to speak about.
Okay, so you're not sure what to talk about. And you can just say you're heard, and then it's my turn, or that just kind of passes it along. Or you can say more until you feel heard.
Yeah, I'm heard.
Okay, that's good. That's how it works. So I'll speak back to you. We're here in Northern California where the smoke is pretty thick. So if Indy and I are coughing, it might be because of that. Indy's even closer to the fires up there in Sonoma. So one of the issues for me around this was something I'm kind of shifting here, but I think it's really related, is about empathy. It's like in the memo that you wrote, you had mentioned de-emphasizing empathy. And I would actually say that the lack of empathy is kind of like the main problem here. So if you just reflect that.
Yeah, so both the fire may be causing both of you to cough a little more. And one thing that's struck you in the memo was how I said de-emphasize empathy for policy decisions, and but this personal empathy is what was lacking in a lot of interactions, and that's what caused a lot of the outrage, maybe.
Exactly. So for me, the environment you're talking about, you go into a group and you're feeling shamed. For me, that's an empathy deficit. So the solution is everybody to be heard, to their satisfaction, and to dialogue, about whatever the topic is. So I guess that's part of my real irritation with Google too, that they didn't take that step. Instead, they just cut off the conversation, fired you. This is a solution. So that's, yeah. So.
Yeah, so, empathy could have stopped some of the shaming, but you feel like Google mishandled the situation by just firing me rather than opening a dialogue.
Yeah, and I'm concerned about that because I'd given talks at Google about empathy. So they're very much into design, human-centered design, which says you use empathy to hear everyone's needs, and then design, through creativity and prototyping to address those needs. And they consider themselves, as I understand it, actually a design company in that sense, using these tenets. So it seems that they're really missing the boat on the empathy component of that.
Yeah, so you've given talks to Google about human-centered design and increasing empathy within your designs, and you feel like Google is really missing it in this aspect.
Yeah, and so in the environment that you're talking about, it sounds like one-on-one, you had this empathic dialogue. You were hearing what the person was saying, they were hearing what you were saying, and you could have that dialogue. And then you get into a group that you're like shut down and not heard for what's going on for you. And for me, that is what empathy is to hear your experience. Like my experience is things, so this doesn't seem quite accurate, and I feel maybe upset about it, or whatever the experience you have, or I feel, diminished or something. So you're able to share that experience and for that to be heard in the group. So for me, that's what empathy is.
Yeah, so you're saying that empathy is being able to be heard within both personal interactions and group interactions, and that was what was lacking. People weren't hearing or weren't willing to be heard, or willing to hear my.
Yeah, in the empathy circle, which we're doing now, this is really slowing down the conversation, right? So it's like everybody gets to speak until they feel heard to their satisfaction, feel like they're heard and understood. And again, for me, that's the essence of empathy. It's just a tool to really hear fully what someone has to say.
Yeah, so empathy circles really may slow down the situation, but it ensures that everyone feels heard, and that's really important.
Right. And the other part is you're in your paper, you're saying you're kind of defining empathy as hearing somebody else's pain. Like, oh, this person has pain, and all the, how people react to that pain. And I think that what you're actually criticizing there is maybe sympathy, people feeling sorry for people and everything that gets wrapped up. I think you're referring maybe to Paul Bloom's articles and that kind of stuff. We've had extended dialogue about that he's actually attacking sympathy, which is a block to empathy. So there's a lot there to kind of unpack and kind of look at, because I think that was sort of a misunderstanding of kind of the deeper nature of empathy.
Yeah, so my breakdown, so you're saying that my breakdown of empathy being the affective and understanding or cognitive empathy, my thing that I was criticizing was actually sympathy, that affective empathy. And so I was sort of mislabeling things, and that created a lot of confusion.
Yeah. So there's a lot more, but my time is up, so I'm going to stick to it.
You hold up the sign to yourself.
Yeah, I got the sign here. So yeah, you can select whoever you'd like to speak to now.
Indy or me?
You select.
You.
You select, James.
I guess I'll talk to you, Edwin.
Okay.
I guess to elaborate on some of the aspects where we weren't being inclusive at Google was just, especially with all the Trump stuff, anyone that expressed any conservative view or said that they, supported Trump in any way, they were completely ostracized. And, it was completely unacceptable to do that. It was seen as counter to Google's core values, which makes people feel completely excluded from the workplace.
So I'm hearing that one thing that you noticed was anyone who was a Trump supporter and would talk about Trump and that they were excluded, or they weren't allowed to talk about that because it was running counter to the Google culture or their values. And maybe you're feeling some concern about that.
Yeah, I feel like in so many of these political arguments or discussions, you really need to be able to hear and understand the other side, because even if you do identify real problems, you don't necessarily know the best solution for it. And, this is sort of how I feel with some of the gender things. Like, yes, there are real problems, but some of the solutions, once you blind yourself to other perspectives, those solutions just won't be able to work, and sometimes they're counterproductive.
Okay, so when you're seeing that, like, conservatives talking about, what's important to them is you need to be able to hear those concerns, because then you can develop solutions for those concerns. And it's the same thing within the gender dialogue, is you have to be able to clearly hear what everyone's concerns are, because then you can create solutions to those concerns.
Right.
If you don't hear the concerns, how can you design solutions for those, to address those concerns? So it's important. It sounds like I'm hearing it's important to you that all of those concerns be heard.
Mm-hmm. And this also extended to some of the white male privilege that they would talk about, where if you were a white male or any intersection of those two, then you simply could not discuss certain topics, and your viewpoint was seen as completely invalid. And it really shuts down discussion, because the whole idea is that as a white male, I can never understand any aspect of someone that's not white or not male. And so I need to try to understand them, but I ultimately can't. And it's just completely asymmetric too, where there's no acknowledgement that males have a unique experience too, and that they have their own struggles that should be acknowledged too.
Mm-hmm. So within the racial top of the white male privilege, it's like, we want you to understand, the message is, we want you to understand, but you'll never be able to understand. because you don't have our experience, so kind of keep quiet because you'll never understand. And so there's like a diminishing of what the white male is saying, and that you're saying that, well, white males have a experience too, and that experience needs to be heard as well. And this is in different areas. There's a racial, gender in different areas. So it's like, it sounds like you're really wanting everyone's concerns, everyone's experience to be heard. I mean, that's a value, is everyone's concerns to be heard, and that's not happening.
Right. And I think a lot of the rhetoric is way too divisive. If you concentrate so much on race and gender, and you make it so that, no, I can't possibly understand someone that has a different one, then there's no way for me to interact, and it just increases the segregation between groups, especially with some of these programs that are only for certain demographics. Those I felt were counterproductive in many ways, and some of the ways where we overprotect certain groups and not others leads to some resentment, and also just some oversensitivity, which is, in my view, harmful in some ways.
Okay, so there's like this oversensitivity that happens, that one group is protected, another isn't, and there's it's creating actually a more polarized. It's actually creating more polarization rather than bringing people together, understanding. So the very approach of the sort of diversity work is actually having the opposite effect, in a sense of then bringing people together. It's creating this separation, polarization, and kind of ineffectiveness. And you're wanting maybe something that's needing more effectiveness.
Right. And so I feel like it reduces the inclusion of the group, and also psychological safety, which is one measure that Google was really excited about. They found that this actually increased team productivity. It's basically the ability to speak up without being harshly judged. And I think it's clear by how harshly judged I was that we don't have a psychological safe environment at Google, at least for certain individuals that have differing views from the major ideology.
So let me see. So it was Google was excited about this process because they see that if everybody can speak up and be included, that it's like more productive and more effective, and that this is actually that you were fired and not heard and not brought in. It's actually showing, this is kind of like demonstrating that this is not really working because your voice, you weren't heard. So this is actually a demonstration that this process is not working.
Right.
I think there was more to it than that. I don't know if I quite got it all, but.
No, that was about it. And yeah, I feel heard.
Okay. Then I'll speak to Indy. And the first thing that's coming up to me is I did take actually a mediation training once, and part of it was with white privilege, about white privilege, and I could just feel this, this heaviness about it. And I said, I'm not taking part in this dialogue, because this does not seem right to me. Because there was other people who were kind of going into it, like males, and they were like literally crying out of guilt. Like, what have we done to these other people? It's so horrible. And then when I kind of said, I don't think this is a positive direction, I mean, everybody came down on me. It was like, so I have some sense of that argument. I mean, that the energy around it, yeah, so.
So it sounds like you have, you're relating feelings somewhat the same as James in a different situation where you had been at a white privilege mediation training. Is that?
Yeah, they had brought up white privilege was an issue.
Oh, okay.
Of
it was in
privilege.
mediation training, and they had brought up white privilege, and it felt like it was taking the group in a direction that was somewhat unproductive, and guys were crying or of guilt, and
yeah,
and people were. The guilt was kind of spiraling, and you thought, well, let's take this in a different direction so we can keep this training going. And people came down on you. And
the direction I was wanting, I said, it's really empathy. If we can listen to each other, just hear each other, that's kind of the way forward. And this was kind of more on the left. So I've been on the left. And I've been very disappointed in terms of what I've been seeing as the deeper I kind of get into some of these issues.
Okay, so what I hear is you are on the left, but with working or maybe just working with people on the left, you sense some disappointment because they have the same tendencies to shut someone down that you ascribed to maybe the other side.
Yeah. And one example is that there was this big rally in Berkeley, which was organized by the right, and then there's this huge counter rally created because it was just after Charlottesville, and I reached out to the organizer of the rally on the right and said, "Would you be willing to do an empathy circle with some people on the left? Some counter or demonstration organizers," and the organizer said, "Sure." And I tried to reach out to the left. I mean, the church groups, the anti-hate groups, nobody would talk to her. And the church groups were saying, "We don't have time." And it was like, it was almost like my eyes have opened to kind of some of the lack of, being willing to empathize and dialogue on the left.
So you're expressing a bit of a shock that on the left, there was stuff going on, or attitudes maybe, or lack of time or interest that you did not expect. And this came when you had successfully gotten agreement from the organizer of the right side of the rally. I don't know how to speak about this.
Yeah.
But gotten no interest or the cold shoulder from those on the left.
Yeah. So this parallels, I think, to what's going on in Google, the left and right. And I think that the ultimate is really to create these dialogues, right? It's that it's kind of like what we're doing, have the empathy circles, we bring people together, and we, slowly, have these kind of structured dialogues. So that's kind of what I'm seeing as a solution, going forward.
So you are expressing optimism and hope that this empathy circle, that taking the time to actually listen and reflect what another person is thinking, could make a difference in these kinds of situations, in the environments, not only like in the communities and nationwide, but within organizations like Google.
Yeah. And within the tech field, the solution to me is like more dialogues within tech. And I don't want to maybe I'm irritated with the left, but ultimately we got to bring them into these dialogues. The feminists, the social justice warriors, the all just the diversity trainers. We just got to get them together and kind of have these dialogues. And it's a long drawn out process, but there's this, if you don't clean up there's this term, this quote by Steve Covey. It's like, it takes a lot of time to kind of, solve these problems, but if you don't address them up front, it even takes a longer time, through, going forward. I mean, now James has got this court case, there's all this stuff. They're going to be dealing with this for years, with this, instead of, just having it out, putting the time up front, and to address this. So yeah, that's the last piece.
Okay, so you're expressing a lot of frustration that we don't seem to understand the value of taking a little time up front to stave off a lot of effort and time and angst later on.
Very much so. Thank you. I feel heard.
Okay. Yay. Do we do that within 5 minutes?
I cheated. I'm going to be tough. You guys had extra time, so I'm trying to...
Okay, you're fine. You're fine. You deserve it. Let's see. I thought of something. So I don't know who to pick. So since Edwin's been so active, I'm going to pick James just to spread it around a little bit. And one of the things that came up for me when I was hearing some of the things you guys were both talking about, two things. One, sort of deep frustration with the mistaken understanding of what empathy is. And also, I somewhat near, but with caution, the idea that that white males also have, stories. I wrote a very long piece in Medium a year and a half, 2 years ago, that it's called Describing Personas. And it came as a result of a tweet that I put out that said, please remove demographics from your persona descriptions, because they cause assumptions. They cause the people to think a correlation is a causation. And that particular article is still getting hundreds of hits every week. People are still discussing it on Twitter. And by and large, the initial discussion was one of pushback. What are you talking about? Of course, we have to talk about the young versus the old. They think, they're totally different. And what I did was I incorporated all the tweets, both the positive and the negative, and spoke to them and explained what I was trying to come up with, which was this idea of thinking styles, to try to, now this is specific to a tool that we use in design called personas. I'm starting to call them thinking styles, which we use them to kick off brainstorming, and we use them to evaluate designs that we come up with, and we use them for strategy to make sure that we are not focusing too broadly, that we're focusing narrowly enough that we can accomplish what we want and be successful. So those tools are used in a lot of ways. And what I wanted them to be were stronger tools by describing the inner thinking of people, which often, almost always, in every study, almost every study that I've done, they have crossed demographic boundaries. They've crossed gender boundaries. They've crossed age boundaries. They've crossed color boundaries. Now, the thing that I say in that essay, which is super important, is that a persona or a thinking style it can only be taken within one context. It cannot be taken globally. And a lot of people try to take it globally. So the lesson there is that if you were to write personas about discrimination, then those demographics do come into play and are very important. But if you're writing personas about how a software engineer solves a bug, then maybe they don't come into play. Or maybe they do. It depends on what the research is saying. If you write personas for people who are considering going to college and deciding which college and which major to take, I've done 2 or 3 studies on that, and they always cross boundaries, demographic boundaries. So the demographics aren't causing this kind of thinking. Anyway, so that was something that I did as a result of frustration, but I was super careful. It took me a week to write that thing, because I wanted to be very careful with my communication and not come off. I use a lot of vocabulary that I don't actually use myself, but I wanted it to put a stake in the sand, or line in the sand, stake in the ground, whatever. And it's working. It's working really well, actually. It's been helping. So it could be an example of something like what you were trying to do. It is working in that people are shifting frameworks, and being able to talk with one another about what might not be functioning very well with that tool that we've been using.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Sorry, that was long.
You first echoed some disappointment in misunderstandings about the definition of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And then you started talking about how you first wrote a Twitter post about how you want people to remove demographic information from their persona. And I guess I'd want clarification on what exactly you mean by persona.
Mm-hmm.
Then you, based on a lot of the responses, and you also wrote a longer piece clarifying your thoughts and taking in different perspectives. And you say that in certain circumstances, your demographics are relevant, but in many others, it can create in people's minds correlations that aren't necessarily causations at all. And you mentioned, discrimination. That is one place where demographics would be relevant, but just
mm-hmm.
general thinking styles often crosses boundaries in these demographics. And so it's wrong to assume that this thinking style is only within a particular demographic, and that just understanding different thinking styles is a very important aspect of human life.
Mm-hmm. Very well summarized. Nicely done. I'm very impressed. So yes, I feel fully heard, although I think you wanted to know more about personas, the tool. I have been helping pioneer the aspect of writing algorithms and software that was originally called the interaction design, that was then called user interface, this is now called, blah, blah, blah. This is now called user experience. And as a part of pioneering this, and there are many of us doing this, we are exploring what could work better, right? What's strong now and what could be even stronger as a tool for us to create software, algorithms, applications, no matter whether it's, internal and very specific to running a power plant, to designing a tractor, or to someone who wants to play a game or pay someone online or something. All of these kinds of things. We see, okay, so it's coming from this. We're seeing how they have not been as stellar as our dreams yet. And we want to make them stronger. How do we do that? One of the tools is this is the tool I use, is to develop cognitive empathy while using affective empathy in listening sessions, taking the data from those qualitative data and mapping it into an opportunity map with a mental model diagram across the top. And also, I create another tool which is called the thinking styles. Those are personas which were pioneered by Alan Cooper, Kim Goodwin, and they are they are to represent a person, an end user, basically, so that as you are trying to brainstorm ideas to support that that end user, as you are fiddling with the design, you're thinking of that end user or those end users. And my hope, and it's starting to happen, is that there will be different solutions, different offerings for different end users, for different thinking styles. So does that give you a better idea of what that tool is? Maybe?
Yes. So I guess to echo what you're saying, you say that you've worked a lot in user experience and that you see a lot of failings in it currently, but you hope that in the future, different user experience and designs will be applied to different thinking styles for the user.
Yes, to the last part. The first part is I think there's a cohort of us developing this practice. We are happy. I mean, we know it's an infant, and we're happy that it's growing, and it's growing very healthily, but it's still growing. So we're looking for colleges now, right? You know, that kind of thing. It's for the infant to attend. The practice, I think, is something that we see in the end going somewhere good that will merge more closely with developers, more closely with product managers.
So I guess you've been developing this and you want it to be seen in practice more, or merging with the developer.
I mean that I guess the tools are separate from the practice.
Right.
Yeah. So the tools are getting used. The practice is growing. That's basically all I was saying. To sort of position the idea that if that the old way that we were doing in this practice of using some demographics to telegraph ideas or ways of thinking, it was incorrect, or was strong but not strong enough, and we can make it stronger by trying with thinking styles. Yeah.
I guess to just reflect that last part, you saying that maybe there are correlations with demographics and thinking styles, but the thinking style is the core thing that you want to look at, and concentrating on that rather than the demographics will give you a clearer signal.
Yeah. I feel heard.
Right.
You get to pick.
I guess I'll talk to Indy. Guess I'll just discuss some of my experience after writing it and some of my hopes for the future, maybe.
Okay.
So I see there being a lot of failings in the current system, in particular media, where there's incentives to just do very clickbaity things and to continue a certain narrative and to fit the data to that narrative rather than just discussing the data and the facts. And so that causes a lot of this bias that we're seeing.
Okay, so I hear you saying that media you used a word earlier, sort of cherry pick in terms of like the way the diversity training was going, and it sounds like media is also sort of cherry picking what fits the cognitive bias they're exemplifying, and that your frustration is that instead of continuing this narrative, there's no discussion going, where I think what you mean is, and tell me if I'm wrong, I think what you mean is, you were saying facts. I think what you mean is being able to hear more people's interpretation of facts and recognize or maybe agree that there are different interpretations of the facts. Right.
Yeah, so I definitely think that there's room for people interpreting the data in the media. It's just that they generally only give one perspective. And
right. Okay.
It's hard to fix because the media doesn't really have an incentive to do otherwise, because their readers just want to be reaffirmed rather than to have their views challenged often. And so it's, even if the journalist wants to be objective, they'll simply get fewer clicks. And so that's one aspect of some of the problems that I feel like we've been seeing. And then,
so let me try to reflect that back. So one of the things that you see we're having problems with, maybe even as a society, is that the way that we hear things through the media is sort of calculated to help the audience feel validated on whichever side, or how, if it's triangular, however many sides, there will be an outlet for you, a media outlet for you, and you go there. And if the journalist, which I thought was really nice to bring up, the journalists themselves might want to be able to discuss all sides of something, their articles will just not get as many clicks, and they won't get as much connection or feedback or airtime, or however you want to quantify that. And I think the very first thing, it went right through my brain. It was a really good point in the very beginning, was that, there is room for interpretation by the media. It's just frustrating that they're only interpreting the side that their audience wants to see.
Mm-hmm. And as social media also amplifies some of these bubbles, and I think causes people, because there's so many ways in which digital media and our phones have caused us to want immediate rewards. It's caused us to not really want to read all the viewpoints, or to really take hard steps to try to solve these issues. And rather than just, no, you're a bigot, rather than, actually trying to understand their perspective, it's much easier and more rewarding for you to just close yourself off and just say something like that rather than engage.
Okay. Yeah. So the things I hear you saying are we've somehow built ourselves this reward system, this feel good, I feel better, and it's too much effort to reach out and touch the thing that feels prickly. And so I'm just going to stick with the thing that feels comfortable. I'm going to read that. That happens in our social media. That happens with the media outlets that we're selecting. And since the journalists who attempt to talk about all different sides and aspects are downplayed, we don't have them anymore, and it belongs or remain. It's not that we don't have them, but they're harder to find, and it remains up to us to do the reaching out to the other side, which isn't happening because there's no reward there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I guess also just a lot of the shaming that happens online.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And anonymity causes this breakdown of discussion, which is also really harmful. Yeah.
So what I hear you saying is dismay and sadness that the anonymity allows people to say mean things to one another that they would never say face to face, and that further encourages people to stick with what's comfortable rather than look around into what might be a different side just to learn and expand their understanding. Okay.
Yeah, I feel
dismay.
hurt.
Dismay and sadness, yes. Okay, yeah. So I
guess one more thing.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
One aspect that also contributes to a lot of this is this guilt by association. So even if you do want to reach out to another side and try to understand it, you become completely marred by interacting with certain individuals, which happened to me too, where I talked to someone that was unpopular for certain opinions that they held. And even if we didn't discuss those opinions at all, my reputation was hurt because I even would be willing to talk to them. And so you create these silos yourself by I mean, not you, but just society by creating this guilt by association.
Oh, interesting. There's a little feeling of anger or disgust that even the fact that you spoke to someone who's on a side opposite of other people that presumably you were working with, you were guilty by association, even if you didn't bring up the opinions that that person was so reviled for within that group. And you felt upset that, I would say angry that there's, even reaching out, even just trying to open up and listen is seen so negatively by the people around you.
Yeah, I'm heard.
Okay. Now I could forget the rules of the game. Who picks?
You select, and you can speak to whoever you want to, Indy.
Me? I select?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I got... So I guess we should include Edwin in this, and I can bring up that empathy thing and speak alongside you. That book Paul Bloom published last year, somehow he managed to get an enormous amount of publicity for a book that's titled Against Empathy. And that publicity propelled him into the very groups that I get to work with. And that book was on the bookshelf, and sometimes it was brought up in conversation. And he was not talking about the empathy that I am seeing as useful in our work. He was speaking about, okay. I think when I was talking with you earlier about it, you say he was talking about a little bit about emotional contagion. It was very dismaying, the amount of publicity he got and the amount of, he got to bend the ear of everybody, and now everybody's sort of like, well, empathy, not so much. And I see it over and over again. I just went to a conference put on by the company I used to be at, Adaptive Path. I was a founding partner, and they have a wonderful series of conferences about design and about managing design and about where is design going, as a practice going next. And by design, we mean very much in the technology world, but also service design and things like that. But anyway, at UX Week, the MC was even like, oh, there's a lot of poo-pooing about empathy. Maybe empathy is not as useful a tool, but compassion is. And so they'll talk about compassion, and the speaker, a fantastic speaker from Stanford, Kelly McGonigal, comes on stage and talks about how to affect compassion in your solutions, in the way that you're brainstorming. And the very first slide, she sort of goes through it sort of starts with somebody suffering. So that's one place to start. And the next step is to pay attention to that person. And she said, I quote, "I cannot say enough about paying attention and how important it is." And then she moved on to the rest of her slides, which was about compassion. She was asked to speak about compassion. And yet they just skipped right over the empathy and the listening part. So I see it over and over again, and I'm constantly writing about it and constantly tweeting about it, and it's in my newsletters, and I did a interview.
Let me reflect back.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, what?
So the first part is you wanted to speak to me because you wanted to be inclusive, was the first thing I hear. Right? So the second part is you were sitting, coming back to the empathy topic and seeing that Paul Bloom had written these criticisms of empathy. And so you're seeing that those criticisms are moving into different areas where you're working in the UX and the software design and so forth area. So you're seeing it is having effect. It kind of maybe dampening the push for empathy. seeing that there's like these misconceptions, and you're kind of going through giving examples of like Kelly McDonald, you know, talking about the importance of compassion and how she is kind of just leaving out the whole empathy component in terms of.
She probably doesn't leave it out, but
Oh,
in her talk.
Her talk kind of left it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So is there more? I can't.
No, that was it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you feel heard, or?
Yeah, I feel heard. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then I'll speak to James. So for me, I guess the question is like, how might we actually foster more dialogue? I mean, open dialogue within the tech community and society at large. So I'm feeling a little bit like, okay, we've kind of explored these different topics, seen a lot of these different problems, you know, things that are shutting down dialogue. So what is it that we can do to actually, you know, foster more dialogue in the tech field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're interested in how we can foster more dialogue in the tech world? Yeah,
basically, like, and maybe even kind of think about, you know, talk about that a little bit, some ideas. And I see, for one, is I see what we're doing here is sort of a first step, you know, one step towards having that dialogue, and then maybe expanding the circle, you know, that we could bring in some social justice warriors or some progressives and social conservatives to have maybe 5-6 people having, you know, a dialogue that we sort of keep scaling up.
Mm-hmm. So you see the possibility of scaling up this circle concept to include more voices, to, you know, see some from the social justice warriors and also social conservatives to get a fuller perspective on things.
Yeah, and it might get a bit more heated too, right? This has been very calm. Everybody's listening. There's not a lot of, you know, anger and frustration. And the empathy circle is actually good for holding, you know, kind of those deeper kind of concerns as well.
So you're saying that, you know, there may be challenges because it's more heated, but the structure of the empathy circle should help mediate that.
Yeah, because this actually comes out of the mediation community, this tool. So yeah, it would help mediate. So I would actually, I mean, it wouldn't happen. I would be willing to set up the empathy tent next to Google and, you know, camp out there and say, we're staying here until you have an empathy circle with James. You know? So that would be, you know, we've been doing this empathy tent, you know, kind of out there in you know, political rallies. So I'd be willing to kind of push the edge, you know, even take it farther to, you know, get Google, you know, to pay attention. And, you know, if Google is willing to have dialogues, you know, it could kind of shift the whole tech, you know, others would take notice.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, you've seen success in bringing the empathy tent to Berkeley, and so you think that bringing it to Google will help engage Google and also just bring more open discussion within the larger tech world.
Yeah, it's like camp out, you know, at the park next to Google. It's like, we're here until you guys come and have an empathy circle, you know. So yeah, that was kind of like something I was kind of imagining. Kind of more of an activist empathy.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Sounds like an oxymoron.
I guess, so you were thinking of just, you know, declaring we're here and we, you know, won't leave until you participate in this empathy circle as part of a way of activism to increase empathy within the tech world. Yeah.
So I'm just, in terms of strategy, I'm just kind of coming up with different ideas and different strategies. I'm curious what both of you think in terms of, like, what can we do to actually foster? Because I've had a real sense that is ultimately what you were trying to create, was just get together, have an open dialogue, nobody's shamed, nobody's excluded, nobody's put down, and then you just really hear what where everyone is, and then, you know, kind of work through some of these issues. And it's dealing with a lot of the social issues too, conservatives, social conservatives, you know, the progressives. So we're dealing with actually a larger context here as well. And so anyway, I was hearing that's kind of what it was that you were interested in ultimately doing, which I totally support.
Yeah, so you understand that I was interested in having these open discussions, and so you're interested in both mine and Indy's ideas for how we can help promote that for the tech world and maybe just the world in general.
Yeah, I feel heard. Thanks.
So
do we keep going, or do you want us to give you ideas?
Yeah, we can, but we'll do it within the reflective empathic listening process. So yeah, so select who you want to speak to, and I think we're going to go for another about 15, 20 minutes.
I guess, Indy, do you have any ideas to start with?
Okay, wait, is this the direction it's supposed to go? Are we right? Yeah, I was thinking back to your description of the training, the diversity training. And I think that an approach would be to go through those channels and perhaps offer to those people who are running those trainings an empathy circle to understand where they're trying to go or come from, and introduce the idea of an empathy circle possibly as a way of practicing within Google. I do know a diversity trainer who's an individual who comes in to corporations, and I have great respect for what she does. I do not know how what she does compares to the diversity trainers that you encountered, James. But I think that there is a lot of thinking and a lot of research and studies that have gone on that have been guiding what the diversity training is, and it would be interesting to hear what that is, and perhaps introduce the idea of the empathy circle. And now I'm repeating myself.
So you're saying that one possible route to introducing some of these ideas is through the diversity practices or classes themselves. And
yeah, I think actually through the trainers themselves, individuals, not getting to the employee level yet, but to those individuals that organize that and that teach that and understand where they're coming from and what maybe they've been doing some thinking about how do we represent different studies and different studies points of view and things like that, or maybe they haven't. It'd be interesting to find out. We do an empathy circle, nice demo, maybe they get interested.
Yeah, so you're saying actually you're getting it through the trainers themselves, and maybe to show the value of empathy circles. Right.
Yeah, and to hear where their thinking is. Yeah, that might be as we're on the spot. We have to think of things on the spot. It's hard to do. So I feel heard. Do I pick James back again?
It sounds like you're already speaking to him. He was reflecting, so it's his turn.
Right. Okay, sorry. I'm so confused.
Right. I guess I'll speak to Indy again then.
Okay.
I guess one idea that I think I was trying to introduce in the document itself was the whole concept of the intolerance to different ideological viewpoints. And I think trying to understand that not all conservatives are just these racist bigots or anything, that they do have different values, and their viewpoints are just based on different values. And it's not that they hate poor people or hate people of color or women. They're basing their views on different values, and that trying to understand that will give more credence to their views, I think.
So it sounds like in the document, one of the other points you wanted to get across, which is that in viewing a member of the conservative, you should not be correlating that with like this certain way of thinking, that each individual has a set of values that might differ slightly from other conservatives, and that it would be much more conducive to being able to work together and hear each other and build things together if we came at people not with that as a face value, with that as seeing behind their eyes they have their own set of values, rather than assuming that they have an ascribed set.
Right. And I think we often assume different people's intent, and that's really harmful. You know, a lot of people saw my criticism of some of the diversity programs as anti-female, when, you know, it was really, you know, I gave many pro-female ways of, you know, how we could empower women to, or how we could change the workplace to make it more amenable to women. And just, I felt like a lot of these programs that treated women sort of as children by the amount of overprotection that we give them, that a lot of people don't feel comfortable with, you know, even women themselves. And I felt like it wasn't speaking, that these diversity programs weren't giving women a voice. It was simply giving this ideology a voice. And that, you know, I heard this many times from other women that felt like they couldn't speak up because whenever they would, then they would be labeled as anti-women, basically.
Okay, let me reflect back. There were a couple of concepts that then got over erased by some of the stuff you said at the end. So I'm going to not remember everything. But what you were saying is that in the document, you were being people were assuming what you meant, and what you really meant was not coming through. They were just making an assumption that that I can't remember what the assumption was, but okay, there's the blank spot. But what you were trying to do was say, hey, the diversity trainings seem to give a voice or a mouthpiece to an ideology, as opposed to a more balanced sort of a program, and that you had heard from individual women that they themselves felt that they were being treated in an overprotected sort of a way, that your document was trying to offer other possibilities to brainstorm around for creating a more comfortable workplace for someone who's female. It's frustrating that got completely lost in the noise because people were making opposite assumptions about you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the assumption was that I was anti-female, or
right.
You know,
okay,
anti-minority in some way, and
yeah,
because I think a lot of it happens simply because they don't acknowledge that there can be different viewpoints, and so the only way for me to have these views is if I were actually a sexist.
Okay, so you were sort of upset, not necessarily, I was going to say shocked, but I wouldn't say that's right, but upset to hear that, or to see that they thought you were anti-female when you were not, and that the mere voicing of different perspectives washes you with a tint that sort of puts you in the camp of an anti-female, and that's why people were making that assumption, because there's this overarching thing. It's like, oh, if they say something that's outside of our bubble, then they must be the opposite, and there's no welcoming or even awareness of the idea that there could be multiple different value sets and points of view that are not anti-female, and yet not necessarily inside that bubbles all the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think simply helping people understand that there are different viewpoints, and that, you know, it's not only the left is, you know, good, the right is evil, for example,
mm-hmm.
which is basically what a lot of people seem to believe.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is making people not feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, and that's cutting down on a lot of the inclusion, and then also clouding our thinking on some of these very controversial subjects like the gender gap.
So you're actually noticing a feeling of discomfort, in a way, discrimination against the idea that you can't bring your whole self to work. You don't feel comfortable saying some of these things because of the reactions you've gotten and the whitewash that you've gotten with respect to the other side. And you said something else, and it's flown from my brain. Can you say it again?
I guess just, yeah, I don't know exactly, but.
Oh, okay. I got the gist of it, though. It's frustrating that that having the inability to be yourself at work is inhibiting your ability to be productive or a good member of a work team, but also it affects your ability and the ability of the whole organization to have discussions about society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when like politics get brought up so often at work. And, you know, a lot of the social conservatives will be fine with just politics being never discussed ever.
Mm-hmm.
But when it is always being discussed, and it's always only one viewpoint, and so ignorantly one viewpoint, then that's what a lot of people are having a problem with. And I guess I'd also mention that, like, I think my struggles with this were much less severe than some of the people that are actually socially conservative. Because
okay, yeah.
Like I mean, my viewpoint is more libertarian, and but then there are some that are completely silenced, and, you know, if they ever come out as, you know, pro-life, then they're completely ostracized.
Right. Okay. Let me reflect back. So it sounds like you're feeling empathy for those who are, say, for example, pro-life, because if they cannot say that at work, because if they do, they will be ostracized. You're also saying, well, you know, there is political discussion, but it's always the social left. I don't have the vocabulary here. The social left, and if you so you just sort of are more comfortable not talking about politics at work normally, but since the talk about politics at work is socially left leaning, then you definitely can't talk about it. But you don't have it quite as bad as someone who would be much more like pro-life.
Yeah, and I guess just to conclude, I think a lot of this also happens because the top executives actually give this viewpoint, and they never allow for a different viewpoint. And so it empowers other employees to say, this is the official viewpoint of Google, therefore I can attack anyone that goes against it. While if the top executives were more inclusive, then I think that would set a really good example for the employees.
So you're saying that the top executives, or the people who are in leadership, their opinions, their political opinions, get adopted as the stance of the whole organization, and that empowers people to attack those who don't adopt that stance. And you think, if you assume or hope maybe as a solution to this, possibly if those leaders would acknowledge other viewpoints and say, this part of this viewpoint here has some value, this point here has some value, this point here has some value, and sort of be more inclusive, then that would change the tenor of discussion and lessen the number of attacks.
Yeah.
Okay.
The company-wide meetings where these views are often espoused is really harmful, I think. It's so often that they're really just spreading these viewpoints, and meetings that used to be purely technical are now getting more and more political.
Oh, fascinating. So you're saying that company all hands meetings, company-wide meetings, are where these opinions get mentioned, or like set as the topic of discussion.
Right.
Okay. And that then now starts to influence meetings that were purely technical before, to start talking about these kinds of maybe social values or political values that the leaders were mentioning in those all employee meetings.
Okay. I feel heard.
Okay.
So should we do one more? If you want to close, Indy, you can speak to either of us, and this will be the closing.
Is there something special that I do in closing?
No, I might just say whatever you. I think the topic was, what do we do next? So you can just. I'll close out after that. But.
Oh, okay. Yeah. What do we do next? I mean, it sounds like.
And who are you speaking to?
Oh, I'll speak to Edwin so you can close. What do we do next? I think there are. I feel pleased to note that a lot of people are interested in becoming more aware of their own judgments and their own reactions and their own assumptions. I have noted that a lot of people are interested in learning this and building that skill. I think we need to give tools to practice or techniques so that people can start to mature their own awareness of what's going through their mind, so that they can sort of push those cobwebs or strands or whatever aside enough to feel strong enough to speak out, and also enough to listen, to embrace another side. I have a very, very close friend whose brother attacks her on Facebook. And she got very, very tired of it. She never attacked him back because that's her nature. And so it seems like it's a matter of, and he's a retired doctor, much, much older than she is. So it seems like rainbows and bunny rabbits for me to say something like, it's exciting to know that people are learning to become more self-aware when that kind of thing exists, and it seems quite intractable. She tried to suggest that maybe there were other points of view, and it was not something that he wanted to listen to. So
let me see if I can reflect that.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing there is that you see that there are people who do want to have more open understanding, connecting sort of connections, but that they're needing and get past judgments, and that there's that people need tools and processes maybe for doing that. And so you do see that there is that interest in doing that. There's those tools and processes that are needed, but that there are plenty of people out there who maybe don't want to have that openness and that listening, like this story that you're talking about, that this person, the I don't know who, the relative was just being very closed, and she's struggling with how to deal with that, with that relationship.
I feel heard.
Oh, is that it? Okay. Well, good. Well, then we'll close there. So I want to thank both of you for taking part in this empathy circle or empathy dialogue circle. And I hope that we can hold some more, maybe make it even a larger circle with more of the opposing views, that it would even be more, something even more contentious. And that it can also perhaps even be a model for those diversity trainers that you were talking about. You can say, hey, take a look at this. These are people from different points of view coming together to dialogue, and maybe this could be a next step. So we'll talk about those things offline, and thank you very much for taking part, and for our viewers for watching this.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.